In yesterday's reflection, I was thinking about Peter in the high priest's garden. And today I want to turn to an event that was actually going on at the same time as Peter was in the garden. Because, of course, he was only in the garden because Jesus was inside the building being questioned inside the high priest's house. And if you think Peter's responses were very clear, I'm definitely not one of his followers, then Jesus' answers to the questions he was asked were frustratingly vague. Here's the story. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they didn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements didn't agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I'll destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I'll build another one, not made with hands." Yet even then their testimony didn't agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you going to answer? What is this testimony that these are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." At that the high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he said. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" Well, Jesus had always been a slightly enigmatic, shall we say, figure, even to those who were supposed to know what he was all about. You might remember that John the Baptist, according to Luke's Gospel, sent to ask this question, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we looking for someone else?" To which the answer was, well, enigmatic, I suppose. Jesus replied, "The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them." It's definitely not a yes or no, is it? Except all these were things that were associated with the expectation of a golden age that would be brought in by the Messiah and that would change everything. Then, of course, we have stories like the feeding of the 5,000 or the Transfiguration, all of them, for those who knew their Hebrew scriptures, pointing to the expectation of a golden age heralded by the Messiah who would change everything. And yet as soon as people drew the obvious conclusions from all this that Jesus might just be the Messiah, he either told them not to tell anyone, keep it secret, or he seemed to deny it by saying, "Well, I'm not the Messiah, but I am, quotes unquotes, the Son of Man." I wonder what the Son of Man was. We could be here for a very long time if I went down that particular rabbit hole. Let's just say that also was an enigmatic term in the first century that could mean many different things to many different people. No wonder the high priest was exasperated. I mean, wouldn't we all be? The disciples certainly were on many occasions, and Judas was so frustrated by it all that it's quite likely that this is what led him to betray Jesus in the first place. He and many others were looking for the Messiah, all right. They were wanting a time when things would change, and if Jesus was the one, then they would follow him. If he wasn't it, or if he didn't match up to their expectations, then why was he playing what looked like silly games? Sometimes semantic games, like, "I may not be the Messiah, but I am the Son of Man." The answer seems to be that Jesus was wanting to understand what it meant to be the Messiah in a rather different way. The common expectation was that the Messiah would have to be a strong man, certainly a man, and certainly a man like a dictator, who at best would boss people into God's kingdom, and most likely would go to war to insist that they join him. But of course, Jesus didn't see himself that way. From the very start, he presented a rather different picture of God. In the world of the first century, there was the dominant view of God in the Greek and Roman world, the God of the philosophers, an almighty, all-powerful God whose outcomes were always successful, and who basically was the strong man, the dictator of the universe. And then there was the warlike God, admired by many religious people, who would slay God's enemies, who would put the world to rights through violence and oppression and exploitation. And then there was Jesus. Whatever else you might say about him, he came in weakness, relatively, and in humility. He was actually giving a different picture of God. And as we reflect on these different pictures, as Christians have been doing in recent times, we should never forget that for Christians, Jesus will always be the ultimate picture of who God is. So it's very easy to criticize Caiaphas, isn't it? And such criticism has often led to fierce anti-Semitism. But as I've thought about this, the reality is, I think, that if we'd been in his place, most of us would have done exactly the same if we'd been there. It's no wonder that he showed his frustrations. He was asking all the big questions that people of his day were asking. Actually, the big questions that people today are asking. And Jesus was being frustratingly vague in his answers. Because behind that question, "Are you the Messiah?" was a series of other questions that the Messiah was hopefully going to address. Who's going to put things right in the world? Who will reverse all the injustices that we see around us? Does anyone care enough to make a difference? Jesus said, well, actually, in the final analysis, being that sort of person isn't so much about occupying a special position as fulfilling a special calling. The calling to establish a world in which God's way of doing things is given priority. And yes, to introduce us to a God whose way begins with acceptance, justice, love, peace, collaboration. You can write the rest of the script yourselves. So I've been thinking about this particular aspect of the story. I realize that running through it all is yet another challenge for us today. Because there's a contrast between the way that religious people typically do things and the way that Jesus operated. There's a bit of a contrast here, intended, I think, by the gospel writers, between organized institutions and the spontaneity of the Spirit. Runs right through the Gospels and comes to its climax in the events of Good Friday. And of course, has run throughout the history of the last 2,000 years. We're never going to be able to rewrite history, but one of the challenges facing for us today is to learn afresh what it means to sit lightly to structures and systems and to follow in faithful discipleship. Institutions can do many good things, but they often find it hard to do the most important things. Institutions have a tendency of doing things right, whereas Jesus calls us to do the right things. The story of Christians who've made a difference in the world has generally been of people who stepped outside the box of doing things the right way and chose to do the right things. And the questions floating around in the first century are still our questions today. Who cares enough about anything to make a difference? Who will be the ones who will pick up Jesus' challenge of a world renewed and become agents of God's justice, which is always going to be a different way of doing things? Join me again tomorrow for more reflections on the stories of Holy Week. And in the meantime, be blessed as you see new opportunities to be God's agent in the world as you experience it on a daily basis.